The gavel came down so hard the whole room flinched. "Remove her. Now." Judge Harold Mercer didn't look up from his bench. He didn't explain himself. He didn't have to, and that was exactly the problem. Every head in Courtroom 14 turned at once. There, seated quietly at a wooden table near the back wall, was a black woman in a plain gray blazer. No lawyer beside her. No briefcase. No stack of files. Just a single manila folder resting flat on the table in front of her, and two hands folded calmly on top of it. Her name was Diana Wells, and in about 40 minutes, this entire courtroom would never forget it. But right now, not one person in that room moved to help her. The bailiff, a heavy-set man named Officer Garland, pushed himself up from his chair near the side door and began walking toward her. Slowly at first, then with more purpose as the judge's impatience filled the air like smoke. "Ma'am," Garland said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "you need to come with me." Diana didn't move. She didn't blink. She looked at Officer Garland the way someone looks at a door they've already unlocked. Calm, prepared, almost patient. "Sir," she said quietly, "I have every legal right to be present at this hearing." That was when Judge Mercer finally looked up. Harold Mercer was 61 years old. He had sat on that bench for 19 years. He was the kind of man who had never once been told no inside this building, and the few times someone had tried, he had made sure they regretted it. His face was square and red, his reading glasses perched at the very tip of his nose, and the look he gave Diana Wells was the kind of look that was supposed to end conversations before they started. "This is my courtroom," he said slowly, "and I said, remove her." The people in the gallery watched in stunned silence. A young paralegal near the front row pressed her lips together. An older gentleman in the third row shook his head slightly, just barely, the way people do when they want to react but are afraid to. A reporter from the county newspaper shifted in her seat and quietly clicked her pen open. Nobody spoke. Nobody stood. Nobody objected. Diana Wells looked directly at the judge, picked up the manila folder from the table, and said 3 words so clearly they carried to every corner of the room. "That would be a mistake." And then, before the bailiff could touch her arm, every phone in 3 rows of the gallery buzzed at the exact same moment. Nobody in that courtroom knew her story. Why would they? Diana Wells looked like what people expect when they imagine someone out of their depth in a legal proceeding. Unrepresented, underprepared, perhaps confused about what courtroom she even belonged in. She was 53 years old, small in frame, with close-cropped natural hair that had gone mostly silver. She wore no jewelry except a thin watch on her left wrist. Her blazer looked like it came from a department store rack, not a tailor. She had driven 3 hours to get here. Alone. She hadn't called a lawyer. She hadn't filed any motions that appeared in the public docket. She hadn't spoken to a single reporter or advocacy group. She had simply shown up, signed in at the front desk, taken a seat in the back of Courtroom 14, and waited. The case on the docket wasn't even about her, not directly. It was a property dispute hearing involving a local development company called Meridian Group LLC, which had been quietly acquiring land across 3 counties. The kind of hearing where things get rubber-stamped by a judge who doesn't ask too many questions, where the paperwork is thick and the audience is thin, where everything is designed to move fast and leave no fingerprints. Diana had grown up in this county. She had gone to school 6 miles from this courthouse. She had watched her neighbors lose their homes one by one over the past 4 years, not because they couldn't pay, but because of decisions made in rooms exactly like this one, by people exactly like Harold Mercer. What nobody knew was what Diana Wells had been doing for the past 23 years before she walked back into this county. She never talked about it. Not to neighbors. Not to her sister in Atlanta. Not even to the few friends who had asked, over the years, why she always seemed slightly removed from everything, watchful, measured, like someone who had spent a long time seeing things most people never see. There was a sealed federal file with her name on it. There was a unit designation most people had never heard of. And there was one document inside that manila folder, a document she had spent 8 months preparing, that was about to change everything about this hearing, this judge, and this county. But what was in it? And how did she know what she knew? Judge Mercer had a system, and the system had worked beautifully for a very long time. It worked because he knew who mattered and who didn't. It worked because the right people got heard and the wrong people got tired and went home. It worked because courthouse staff knew better than to question him, lawyers who appeared before him knew better than to push back, and citizens who wandered in looking for justice usually wandered back out with nothing, confused, defeated, and quietly convinced that the law simply wasn't on their side. Diana Wells was supposed to be one of those people. When she didn't stand up immediately after his second command, Judge Mercer set his pen down with a sharp click and removed his glasses entirely. This was what people in the courthouse called the full stop, the moment Mercer decided someone needed to be made an example of. "Bailiff," he said, his voice dropping to something low and deliberate. "Remove this woman from my courtroom and have her cited for contempt. If she resists, have her detained." A woman in the gallery gasped. Not loudly, just a small, involuntary sound of disbelief. The young paralegal near the front stood up halfway from her seat, then seemed to think better of it and sat back down. Officer Garland reached Diana's table. He put his hand on the back of her chair. Diana turned and looked at him very directly, without anger, without fear, and said, "Officer, I am asking you to wait 60 seconds. What I am about to present will affect your career if you don't." Garland froze. Something in her voice, not the words but the tone, made his hand drop from the chair. Mercer saw it. His face darkened. "Are you threatening an officer of this court?" His voice filled the room. "Because I want everyone in this gallery to witness this. This woman, uninvited, unrepresented, is now threatening a bailiff in a court of law." He turned to the gallery with the theatricality of a man who had performed this role so many times it had become instinct. This is what happens when people don't respect the legal process. He was using the room as a weapon. He was using public shame as enforcement. He had done it dozens of times. But something was wrong. The people in the gallery were not looking at Diana the way he expected. They were looking at her the way people look at someone they're beginning to understand they may have badly misjudged. Because Diana Wells had not raised her voice once. She had not trembled. She had not pleaded or apologized or tried to explain herself to a man who had already decided she wasn't worth explaining to. She simply placed her hand flat on top of the manila folder, looked at Judge Harold Mercer directly, and said, "Your Honor, I respectfully submit that you do not want this proceeding to continue without reviewing what I have in front of me." Mercer slammed the gavel. "Contempt. Bailiff. Remove her now or you'll be standing next to her." And that was the moment the back door of the courtroom opened. It started with the phones. That simultaneous buzzing across 3 rows had not been a coincidence. 12 people had received an encrypted notification at precisely the same moment. A trigger Diana had set in place weeks before she ever walked through those courthouse doors. A dead man's switch, essentially. If she submitted a specific document to the court's intake system, and that document was not acknowledged within a set window of time, the notification went out automatically. She had submitted it at 9:02 that morning. The window had closed, and now 12 people knew about it. But the people in the gallery didn't know that yet. What they saw instead was something much simpler and much stranger. A door at the back of the courtroom opened slowly, and a man in a dark suit stepped inside. Then another door on the left side opened. 2 more suits. Then the main entry, 3 at once. They entered without drama. No shouting, no drawn weapons, no announcement. Just 12 federal agents in a measured, deliberate spread across the room. Badges held out at shoulder height, faces unreadable, filling the space the way water fills a container. The attorney for Meridian Group LLC, a man named Patrick Sauls who had appeared before Mercer dozens of times without ever once losing, went the color of notebook paper. Judge Mercer gripped the edge of his bench. "What is the meaning of?" he started. The agent who walked to the center of the room held up a single hand, not aggressively, just clearly enough to communicate that what was about to happen was going to happen regardless of what the judge said next. "Your Honor," the agent said, "my name is Special Agent Marcus Webb, Federal Bureau of Investigation. We are here pursuant to an active federal investigation. This proceeding is now paused pending review of certain materials." He turned briefly to Diana Wells. "Thank you, Ms. Wells." The room erupted. Not in shouting, in the kind of collective stunned whisper that sounds louder than shouting because everyone is making it at the same time. Diana Wells opened the manila folder. And what the reporter in the fourth row saw, before two agents gently moved to block the gallery's line of sight, was the edge of what appeared to be a financial ledger, a series of wire transfer receipts, and a photograph of Judge Harold Mercer shaking hands with a man the reporter immediately recognized as the CEO of Meridian Group LLC. The question the whole room was now asking was the same question the reporter was already typing into her phone. How long had this been going on? And how did Diana Wells know? Have you ever watched someone in power abuse that power with total confidence, and felt completely helpless? Because what you're about to find out is why that confidence is almost always the thing that destroys them in the end. Diana Wells had not walked into that courtroom on instinct. She had walked in with 23 years of preparation. After college, Diana had been recruited into a division of the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, that almost nobody outside of federal law enforcement had ever heard of. She spent 11 years tracking money flows, the kind of money that moved quietly through shell companies, dummy LLCs, charitable foundations, and real estate transactions designed to look completely ordinary from the outside. She had retired from that work 7 years ago, but she had never stopped watching. When her childhood county began bleeding residents in 2019, when property values in specific corridors mysteriously dropped right before development companies swooped in to buy, she recognized the pattern. She had seen it in other cities, in other states, in cases she had spent years untangling for the federal government. This wasn't market forces. This was manufactured. The deeper she looked, the bigger it got. Meridian Group LLC was not a local company. Its registered address was local, a strip mall office suite near the highway, but its money came from a holding company in Delaware, which was owned by a trust registered in the Cayman Islands, which received capital disbursements from a fund based in Luxembourg. Diana had mapped the entire chain. Every node, every transfer, every timestamp. At the center of the web was a man named Gerald Cross, a real estate developer and political donor who had never once appeared in any local coverage of Meridian Group, but whose fingerprints were on every major acquisition it had made. And at the local level, the level that made it all work, that made the hearings go smoothly and the objections disappear and the paperwork sail through without scrutiny, was Judge Harold Mercer. The financial relationship between Mercer and Cross dated back 11 years. It had been structured carefully. Not bribes in the obvious sense. Instead, a vacation property purchased well below market value, a college fund contribution routed through a third party, consulting fees paid to a shell company Mercer controlled through his brother-in-law. Nothing that would catch a local auditor's eye. Everything that would catch Diana's. Agent Webb's team had been building a parallel investigation for 8 months. Triggered, in fact, by a tip filed through a FinCEN whistleblower portal under a name that would later be confirmed as an alias Diana had used during her federal career. She hadn't just walked in with evidence. She had walked in as the source of an entire federal case. And there was one more layer. The property at the center of today's hearing, the parcel Meridian Group was seeking court approval to acquire through an eminent domain workaround, belonged to 7 families. 6 of those families had already been displaced. The 7th had refused to leave. That 7th family's last name was Wells. It was Diana's mother's house, the house she had grown up in, the house where she had learned to read at a kitchen table that was still there, in a neighborhood that was being systematically erased. She hadn't come here for justice in the abstract. She had come here for her mother's front porch. The gallery had stopped being a passive audience about 6 minutes after the federal agents entered. The reporter, her name was Christine Okafor, and she covered the county beat for the regional paper, had already sent 3 text messages to her editor and was now photographing the room with her phone barely concealed behind a notepad. 2 people in the gallery had begun filming openly. Agent Webb had initially asked them to stop. Now his team had quietly decided it wasn't worth the optics of trying. Patrick Sauls, the Meridian Group attorney, had asked twice to speak. Both times he had been told, politely and firmly, to wait. He was now sitting with his hands clasped on the table in front of him in the posture of a man calculating how quickly he could cooperate his way out of a very bad situation. What turned the room completely was what happened when the witness list came out. As part of Agent Webb's procedural pause, a junior agent passed a sheet to the court reporter, a woman named Beverly Hatch who had worked in Courtroom 14 for 12 years. Beverly looked at the sheet. Her expression didn't change, but she quietly slid her own notepad to the side and folded her hands on the desk. Because Beverly Hatch's name was not on that witness list. But 3 names were on it that changed everything for the people watching. A former Meridian Group project manager who had signed a cooperation agreement 4 months ago. A county assessor's office employee who had been placed on administrative leave the previous month under circumstances the county had described only as an internal personnel matter, and a retired federal judge from the Western District who had flagged irregularities in cross-county eminent domain filings 18 months ago, and been quietly told his concerns were outside his jurisdiction. Every person in that courtroom understood at the same moment what they were actually seeing. This wasn't a real estate hearing that had gone sideways. This was the conclusion of something that had been coming for a very long time, and the woman they had all watched being ordered out of the room was the reason it was arriving today. An older man in the gallery, one of the headshakers from earlier, stood up. Just stood up. He didn't say anything. Agent Webb glanced at him, then looked away. The man stayed standing. A minute later, 3 more people stood. Nobody told them to. Nobody organized it. It was just the instinct of people who had watched something wrong for a long time and finally felt the balance begin to shift. Diana Wells was still seated at her table. She had not looked at the gallery once. She was looking at the folder in front of her, and on her face was an expression that was not triumph. It was something quieter. Something that looked like a long exhale after years of holding your breath. Judge Harold Mercer was removed from his bench at 11:17 in the morning. He didn't leave dramatically. He didn't rage or threaten or make a speech. He was simply asked to step down, and he did, moving slowly, one hand gripping the edge of the bench as he descended the steps, his face blank in the particular way that faces go blank when someone has finally run out of all their moves. He was escorted through a side door by 2 agents. The court reporter noted the time. The gallery watched in total silence. Patrick Sauls spoke next. His voice was careful and stripped of all its courtroom confidence. "My client intends to fully cooperate with the federal investigation," he said. "The Meridian Group will be suspending all pending acquisitions pending a comprehensive legal review," which was another way of saying the game was over and everyone knew it. Agent Webb then did something that is not standard procedure but which he would later describe as simply the right thing to do in the moment. He turned to Diana Wells and spoke directly to her, in front of everyone. "Ms. Wells," he said, "I want to acknowledge formally, for the record, that this investigation would not exist without your work. The filing you submitted today confirmed the last link in a chain of evidence we have been building for the better part of a year. You came here alone, you were treated with contempt." He paused slightly on that word deliberately. "And you did not back down. The Bureau thanks you." There was a moment of absolute stillness. And then Christine Okafor began to clap. Slowly, once, twice, and the gallery followed. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a movie moment with swelling music and people on their feet. It was the sound of an ordinary room full of ordinary people recognizing that something extraordinary had just happened in front of them. Diana Wells looked up. For the first time since she had entered that courtroom, she let herself look at the people around her. She pressed her lips together. She nodded once. But here is the detail that nobody who was in that courtroom that day ever forgot. When the agents began gathering materials and people began to stand and gather their things, Beverly Hatch, the court reporter who had been in that room for 12 years, who had typed up hundreds of Mercer's rulings without a word, walked over to Diana's table. She was carrying something. It was the court reporter's own copy of the morning's proceedings, already time-stamped and sealed. She set it in front of Diana. "For your records," Beverly said quietly. 2 words. That was all. But Diana looked at Beverly for a long moment, and what passed between them in that look was the understanding of 2 women who had both stayed quiet far longer than they should have had to, and who both understood now that the staying quiet was finally done. What would you have done in that room? Would you have stood up when nobody else would? The story didn't end when the agents walked out. In the weeks that followed, federal prosecutors filed charges against Harold Mercer on 7 counts including wire fraud, bribery, and obstruction of justice. 3 Meridian Group executives were indicted alongside him. The county assessor's office employee entered a cooperation agreement. Gerald Cross, the man whose name had never once appeared in local news, was arrested at his home in a gated community 2 states away. 41 property acquisitions across 3 counties were placed under federal review. Of those 41, 26 were found to involve irregularities that had allowed Meridian Group to obtain land at below market value through coordinated manipulation of assessments, zoning decisions, and court hearings. Families began returning. Not all of them. Some had moved on, rebuilt elsewhere, couldn't or wouldn't come back. But some did. And for the ones who came home, the houses were waiting. Diana Wells' mother's house, the one at the center of the hearing that had never been meant to go any other way, was never transferred. The eminent domain filing was voided. The house stayed exactly where it had always been, at the end of a street Diana had ridden her bike down as a child, with the same front porch and the same wooden railing her mother had painted white every spring for 30 years. Diana stayed for a while. She helped other families navigate the review process, gave statements to 3 separate federal investigations, and testified once in a preliminary hearing where she sat at the witness table with the same stillness she'd had when a judge tried to throw her out. She never gave a press interview. Christine Okafor wrote the story, a long, careful, documented account that was picked up nationally, but Diana declined to be quoted directly. "The story is the evidence," she told Christine. "The evidence speaks fine on its own." The Meridian Group eventually filed for bankruptcy. Harold Mercer received a sentence of 9 years. He served it. Beverly Hatch, the court reporter, was recognized in the state legislature for her quiet act of bearing witness. She was asked if she had anything to say. "I just did my job," she said. "I was just late doing all of it." And that line, "I was just late doing all of it," stayed with a lot of people, because it touches something most of us know about ourselves. The moments where we saw something wrong and said nothing. The times we let the room's silence become our own silence. The moments where the cost of speaking felt too high and so we calculated the math and stayed in our seats. Diana Wells spent 8 months preparing to walk into a courtroom alone, with no lawyer, no ally, no guarantee that any of it would work, because she believed the evidence was enough if someone was willing to carry it through the door. She had walked into rooms far more dangerous in her career. She had walked through rooms where the wrong word could end things permanently. She had learned, in 23 years of watching how power hides itself, that the moment power feels most untouchable is usually the moment right before it breaks. She carried the proof. She carried it calmly. She waited for the right moment. And she refused to leave. There will always be rooms where someone like Harold Mercer points at someone like Diana Wells and says, "You don't belong here, you don't matter, you have no power in this space." And there will always be a silent gallery calculating whether it's worth it to stand up. But here is what that courtroom taught everyone who was in it that morning. The person they dismiss the quickest is often the one who has been watching them the longest. Power doesn't fall because someone outside tears it down. It falls because someone patient and prepared and quiet as stone walks through the front door, sits down at the table, places a folder flat in front of them, and refuses to be moved. Diana Wells drove back to her mother's house that evening. She sat on the front porch as the sun went down. Her mother brought out 2 glasses of sweet tea, sat down beside her, and didn't ask a single question. She didn't need to. Some things, when they're finally done, don't need to be spoken. They just need to be felt. In the weight lifting off your shoulders, in the porch boards under your feet, in the knowledge that the house is still standing and the people who tried to take it are gone. If you have ever been dismissed, overlooked, underestimated, if someone has ever pointed at you and said leave, as if your presence was the problem, remember this: your calm is your power. Your preparation is your weapon. And the truth, carried long enough and carefully enough, always finds its room.